Not all financial variables behave the same way, and this is one of the biggest mistakes people make when forecasting. They treat rent, groceries, debt payments, subscriptions, insurance, investment contributions, and discretionary spending as though they all follow the same pattern, but they don't. Some variables are stable, some are behavioral, some are inflation sensitive, some are structurally rigid, and some quietly compound pressure beneath the surface. So before we can forecast the future, we need to understand how different financial variables behave through time. And because forecasting is built around time, we are going to make one small but important notational shift. Instead of using X as the generic independent variable, we will use T. In this series, T means time. Unless otherwise specified, T will represent time in years. So if T equals 1, we are 1 year into the forecast. If T equals 2, we are 2 years into the forecast. If T equals 5, we are 5 years into the forecast, and so forth. That matters because forecasting is not just about numbers. Forecasting is about how financial systems evolve through time. And in this video, we begin building the first real forecasting tools inside the household financial operating system. Not abstract math, not classroom equations, but mathematical models that describe real financial behavior. Because formulas are simply descriptions of patterns through time. The single most important forecasting rule is this: different variables require different forecasting methods. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. Forecasting becomes dangerous when we apply the wrong behavioral assumption to the wrong variable. Rent does not behave like restaurant spending. Debt payments do not behave like gasoline costs. Utilities do not behave like Netflix subscriptions. Investment portfolios do not behave like credit card balances. Each variable follows its own behavioral pathway, its own trajectory, its own mathematical structure. And once we recognize this, forecasting becomes far more realistic. The goal is not to make a perfect prediction. The goal is to model the behavior of the system well enough to make better decisions. Let's begin with fixed costs. Fixed costs are relatively stable financial obligations that do not fluctuate dramatically with short-term behavior. Examples include rent, mortgage payments, insurance premiums, subscription services, property taxes, internet plans, and some loan payments. Now, fixed costs are not truly fixed forever. Rent can increase, insurance can reset, a mortgage can renew, subscriptions can rise, but over a short forecasting window, fixed costs often behave predictably. Mathematically, a stable fixed cost structure may look like this: y equals 2,500. Here, y represents the forecasted cost. The value stays constant, and t, time, does not affect the value in this simplified model. That means the cost remains the same whether we are forecasting year 1, 2, 3, or whatever. This is a horizontally stable structure. But stable does not mean harmless. Fixed costs create structural rigidity. The higher the fixed cost burden, the less adaptive flexibility exists inside the household operating system. This is why a household can look financially stable when income is strong, but become fragile when income falls. Because fixed obligations remain even when conditions change. The next basic tool is linear forecasting. Linear forecasting assumes that a variable changes by a steady amount over time. The basic structure is the equation of a line: y equals mt, because we're using t instead of x, plus b. So it follows that form, y equals mx plus b, except that x is t representing time. In this formula, y is the forecasted variable, t is time, usually measured in years, b is the starting value or base level, and M is the slope or the amount of change per year. This is useful when something increases at a steady rate. For example, assume a household expense starts at $400 and increases by $50 per year. That could be written as y equals 50t plus 400. At t0, the cost is 400 because 50 times t, which is 0, is 0. At t equals 1, the cost is 450 because 400 plus 50 times 1 is 450. At t2, the cost is 500, and so on and so forth. This kind of model is simple but powerful. It helps viewers understand that some financial variables follow a steady directional path, not flat, not explosive, just gradually changing through time. Now let's move into variable costs. Variable costs fluctuate with behavior. Examples include groceries, fuel, dining out, entertainment, travel, clothing, and discretionary lifestyle spending. Unlike fixed costs, variable costs move dynamically through time. They often respond to inflation, lifestyle changes, family size, economic conditions, habits, and emotional decision making. A variable cost forecast might look like this: y equals 400 plus 80t. Here, 400 is the starting level of spending. 80t means spending rises by $80 per year, and t represents time in years. So this formula is saying the cost starts at 400 and increases by $80 each year. This is where forecasting becomes powerful, because now we are no longer just recording what happened, we are modeling how behavior may evolve. This is no longer expense tracking, this is behavioral systems analysis. Some financial variables are partially fixed and partially variable. These are called mixed costs and were dealt with in another video. Examples include utilities, electricity, cell phone plans, vehicle operating costs, maintenance spending, and some insurance structures. There may be a fixed structural component plus a variable usage component. A mixed cost structure may look like this: y equals 80 plus 120t. In this simplified example, 80 represents the fixed base component, 120t represents the variable component increasing over time, and t represents time in years. The key insight is this: many household expenses are not purely fixed or purely variable. They exist somewhere in between. And that means good forecasting requires decomposition. We need to separate what is structurally committed from what changes with behavior, usage, or external pressure. This is exactly where managerial accounting becomes extremely useful in personal finance, because managerial accounting gives us the tools to understand cost behavior, and cost behavior is the foundation of forecasting. Some variables are especially sensitive to inflation. Examples include groceries, fuel, childcare, utilities, insurance, repairs, and healthcare costs. These variables often do not simply rise by the same dollar amount every year. Instead, they may grow by a percentage. This means they compound. A basic inflation-sensitive model looks like this: y equals y naught, or y subscript 0, open bracket 1 plus I, close bracket, raised to the exponent t. Here, y is the future value, y naught, or y subscript 0, is the starting value. I is the inflation or growth rate, and t is time in years. This formula tells us that the future cost depends on the starting amount, the growth rate, I, and the amount of time that passes, t. For example, if groceries started at $1,000 per month and inflation is 4% per year, the annualized cost grows through time by 1,000, the starting amount, times, open bracket, 1 plus 0.04, which is 4% in decimal format, close bracket, raised to the power of t. So if it's 1 year, then we'd raise it to the 1. If it's 2 years, we'd raise it to the 2. This matters because compounding transforms small annual changes into large long-term effects. A 4% increase may not feel dramatic in 1 year, but over 5 or 10 years, the effect becomes much more meaningful. This is why inflation-sensitive forecasting is so important, because inflation does not just affect today's cost, it changes the future trajectory of the entire household system. Now, many financial variables do not behave independently. Instead, they depend on other variables inside the system. This is called driver-based forecasting. In driver-based forecasting, one forecast becomes the input for another forecast. For example, transportation expenses may not remain constant in absolute dollars. Instead, transportation spending may behave as a relatively stable percentage of income. As income rises, commuting patterns may change, vehicle choices may change, fuel consumption may increase, and travel behavior may expand, which means transportation expense may depend on future forecasted income. Mathematically, this may resemble if income is forecasted as as a function of t, meaning income is a function of time, equals 60,000 times 1.04, which is assuming a 4% increase over time, raised to t, which is the number of years. And let's say transportation historically averages 12% of income, then transportation expense becomes 0.12 times the income function. Now the transportation forecast automatically changes as income changes. This is a major shift because the system is no longer forecasting variables independently. What I mean by that is transportation expense doesn't just grow by a certain amount, it's linked to the income variable. The variables become interconnected. And once financial variables begin interacting dynamically through time, the household operating system begins behaving like a true integrated forecasting architecture. This is where forecasting, managerial accounting, FP&A, economics, and systems engineering begin converging into one unified framework. The key insight is this: the strongest forecasts are not isolated lines. They are connected systems. Now we arrive at one of the most dangerous forecasting variables, debt. Debt can compound pressure through time, especially high interest debt, revolving debt, variable rate debt, unpaid balances, and structurally leveraged systems. A compounding debt trajectory might look like this. Y equals 10,000 times 1.18 to the exponent t. Here, the starting debt balance is $10,000. The growth rate is 18% per year, and t represents time in years. Notice what this formula communicates. The trajectory does not rise evenly, it accelerates. That is the mathematics of fragility. Small pressures become amplified through time. And this is precisely why forecasting matters, because compounding systems reward strong positioning, but they punish weak positioning. Investment growth can compound positively, debt pressure can compound negatively. The math is similar, the system outcome is completely different. Once we understand that different variables behave differently, the entire forecasting framework changes. We stop treating all financial categories identically, and we begin building behavior-specific forecasting systems. Now, fixed costs, linear growth variables, variable costs, mixed costs, inflation-sensitive costs, and compounding debt systems can each be modeled more realistically. This dramatically improves forecasting accuracy, scenario analysis, stress testing, liquidity planning, and optionality preservation. And this is where the household financial operating system begins resembling true FP&A. Because the goal is no longer simply recording the past. The goal becomes understanding future trajectories before they arrive. This is the shift from bookkeeping to forecasting, from reporting to positioning, from reacting to adapting. In the next episode, we begin introducing one of the most important concepts in all forecasting systems, choosing the right forecasting tool for the right variable. Because not every financial variable should be forecasted the same way. Some variables are best forecasted using vertical analysis, percentage relationships, and driver-based structures. Others require horizontal trend analysis, amortization schedules, depreciation schedules, inflation modeling, or compounding frameworks. And once we begin selecting the correct forecasting architecture for each variable, the household operating system starts becoming far more realistic, far more adaptive, and far more powerful. Because forecasting is not about applying one equation to everything, it is about understanding how different financial structures behave through time, and then matching the correct mathematical tool to the correct financial behavior. This is where forecasting stops becoming simple projection and starts becoming financial systems engineering.